This is a CBS News special report. I'm Jeff Glor in St. Pete Beach, Florida, with the latest on Hurricane Irma. Good morning. This powerful Category 4 hurricane is just really beginning to batter this state with maximum sustained winds of 130 miles an hour. Anthony Mason is at CBS News headquarters in New York. He'll be getting the latest forecast from meteorologist Eric Fisher in just a moment. Irma made landfall about 90 minutes ago in the lower Keys, the chain of islands off the southern tip of Florida. The eye hit Cudjoe Key, about 20 miles east of Key West. Irma is now moving northward up the Gulf Coast toward us here in St. Pete Beach. There's a very wide storm. Hurricane or tropical storm force winds extend about 220 miles from the center. Some places could get as much as a foot of rain. Irma is already blamed for 3 deaths here in Florida after killing more than 24 as it tore across the Caribbean last week. Well over 1 million homes and businesses in Florida have lost power. More than 6 million people were ordered to evacuate as this storm approached. Many of the shelters in this area have been activated by the governor. In all, about 7,000 members of the Florida National Guard are working. We have a team of correspondents, producers, and photographers deployed throughout the hurricane zone. Manny Bojorquez is in Naples, which could get a big brunt of this storm and is already getting that right now. Actually, we're going to go to Manny Bojorquez is in Fort Lauderdale. Manny?
That's right. We are in Fort Lauderdale, where winds are expected to reach 75 miles per hour later today. And as you can see, we are well on our way to that. What we've been seeing here throughout the morning is these gusts picking up, the rain increasing. Any of these shrubs or tree branches that are not strong are falling into this canal right here. And speaking of this canal, I can tell you that from being here last night to what we're seeing now, it is definitely rising. So the concern here, not just the strong winds that we're seeing right now and the rain, but of course the storm surge and the flooding that might happen. Here in Broward County, you have 15,000 people who are riding this storm out in shelters. That's what officials wanted to see. And the reason why is because those buildings are strong enough to withstand some of the impacts of the wind here, but also because right now you have a situation because of these weather conditions where you cannot have law enforcement on the roads. They cannot respond to all the calls that they're getting right now. We do know that as the storm continues to pummel this area, there are power lines down, there are trees down, and you can see exactly why that would be happening. There are palm fronds that are just swirling around the parking lot next to us right now. We are cognizant of the fact that there is the danger of flying debris here right now. But again, we wanted to let you know what the conditions are. To give you perspective, where we are right now is about 100 miles away from where Irma made landfall. That should tell you how large this storm is and how widespread the impacts will be. Think about that, 100 miles away, and the impacts, the effects of this hurricane are that strong. Jeff?
Manny, thank you very much. Yeah, you talk about the breadth of this hurricane. Mark Strassman is in Miami and southeastern Florida, which isn't going to get the worst, but it's still very bad. Mark?
It is really bad, Jeff. These are really punishing winds here. You can sort of see on my face and just all around me here. When you cross a street like this, which really is a wind tunnel, you have to look both ways, not for traffic because there is no traffic, but for flying debris, for tree limbs, and for traffic signs. Flash flooding, another issue here. There's flash flooding up and down here. It's not coming from storm surge. It's just flash flooding, at least so far. Most people, of course, have evacuated here, and with good reason. This was the largest evacuation in Miami-Dade's history, an area that obviously has seen lots of hurricanes come and go over the years. But for people who had decided to stay put and hunker down, they're really on their own at this point. Just as Manny was talking about with emergency responders up in Broward, in Miami-Dade, by and large, they're not responding to calls. If somebody needs help, they got to figure it out on their own. So there are a number of people probably who are having serious second thoughts about their decision to stay put. More than 700,000 people have lost power in South Florida's 3 major counties. That could be a lingering issue that goes on for days, even weeks, depending on how widespread power outages are in the rest of Florida. these conditions are not getting better. In fact, in the last hour or so, I would say, they've picked up and gone up to the next level. We had one measurement, a wind gust of 98 miles an hour about a half hour ago. In general, I would say these are 60-plus mile-an-hour winds here in downtown Miami, and this is really no place for anyone to be. The advice to people, wherever they are at this point, is no matter how scared you get, you have to hunker down. You cannot leave. The worst place to be during these conditions is out in a car, exposed on a highway, exposed to the full conditions and wrath of the storm. That's the worst. So, Jeff, bad here, and again, it doesn't look as though it's going to improve anytime soon.
Yeah, Mark, I was going to ask you about that. I was just in Miami with you, and that was one of the big concerns from police.
All right, we've lost Jeff Glor for the moment. It's Anthony Mason in New York. Mark Strassman, thanks very much. Mark, you guys are no longer expected to feel the worst of it down there, but as we can see, it's already very bad.
It is bad, and this morning when I got up, 4:30 this morning or so, I could hear the howling, the whistling of the storm raging outside. There were people who were getting up already. They couldn't sleep. It was a combination, I think, of the noise and the anxiety factor. And over the last 5-6 hours, as we've stood out here, it has progressively gotten worse. And this is as bad as you can see. You can see these sheets of rain, or sheets of water at least, just rushing up the street. About 5-6 minutes ago, the second traffic sign in the last hour that has sheared off of its stand came flying down the street. Those things are extremely dangerous. I mean, that's the kind of thing that could take your head off if you're not careful.
Yeah.
So the whole sense that some people have of, I'm going to ride this one out. If they're going to ride this one out, they really better have a safe place and be just like hunkered down, battened down, and good to go, because this is really not a place to take any risks that are unnecessary. And just being here for people who are, especially for people who are unprepared, is a huge risk in itself.
Mark, what's your sense in terms of in the city of people who left? I mean, did you get a sense that a lot of people decided to get out of the city before this?
Yeah, it was the largest mass evacuation in Miami-Dade history, about 670,000 people. And let's face it, this is an area that has seen a lot of hurricanes and dealt with a lot of evacuations. The interesting thing to me was that even people who've lived here for a while and in the past who have had a bit of a blasé attitude about a Category 1 or a Category 2 hurricane that's on the radar and heading this way, they took this one seriously. I mean, there were lots of people here who said, I'm evacuating for the first time, the very first time, just because this one, there's something about it, it just seems different to me. It scares me. And they went, by and large, inland as far as they could. Now, a lot of them, frankly, and especially if they left 72 hours ago, were heading up towards Naples, Tampa, what turned out to be the wrong direction. There are a number of evacuees from Miami who, instead of leaving the hurricane, will now drive right into the heart of Irma's path. And that's going to be another issue, is that not only the folks in Tampa Bay, who by and large were not nearly as prepared for this because they did not have the kind of storm warning, literal storm warning, that South Florida had. Now you also have some folks from South Florida who had the storm warning, who went up I-75 all the way to Tampa Bay, and they now are in the path of this storm too. It really is an awful combination of circumstances all the way around.
All right, Mark Strassman in Miami, where, as he said, they felt gusts already up to 90 miles an hour. Be careful out there, Mark. We want to bring in Eric Fisher now, chief meteorologist at our Boston station, our CBS Boston station, WBZ. Eric, thanks for being with us. And there is a brand new update on this storm.
Yep, we just got the 11 o'clock advisory in from the Hurricane Center. No major change, and that's not good news for Florida. It's staying at that same intensity, 130 mile per hour winds, and it's picking up a little bit of steam now as it moves farther off toward the north. So you see the eye of the storm now starting to leave the Keys, but those outer bands, they extend over a large area. That's been part of the message with this storm, the fact that it's not all just in the center. Your strongest winds are around the eye, but the impacts cover a much larger footprint. So there are the latest stats at 11 o'clock, 130-mile-per-hour winds. That's a Category 4 hurricane. That's how it made landfall this morning. It's the first time on record we've had 2 Category 4 hurricanes in one season in the United States. And you see that motion now north at 9, picking up speed as it made that turn. It's like moving an 18-wheeler. It takes a little while. It was heading west, and now that it's heading north, moving a little bit faster, and that trend will continue. So here's the latest track. There are no major changes. That center of the storm will skirt all the coast from the Naples area, where things are really starting to go downhill, up toward Fort Myers and Sanibel. As we head into this evening, we're looking at the Tampa area. Tomorrow, we're looking up toward the Big Bend of Florida, still at hurricane strength. And even as it heads toward Georgia and Alabama, because of that increasing wind field, we'll see at least tropical storm force winds heading inland. And so with that, you're talking about major power outages. We're already over 1 million. We certainly would expect that number to climb toward 2, 3, maybe even 4 million as we look toward these next couple of days. So that track is a dangerous one for South Florida, and it is kind of reminiscent of Donna, which oddly enough made landfall on this exact day in 1960 and is also the last time the Keys had a Category 4 hurricane, and it's on the peak of hurricane season today, September 10th. So a lot of things culminating here. Anthony, the big change is that 1960, we didn't have nearly the population, the buildings, development that we do now. A place like Marco Island, that's right in the path, is very different.
Eric, take me through the day here as it's going to look now, because this, as you said, is a 2-day event essentially along the coast of Florida. The first major target for essentially near the eye is what? Naples?
Be around Marco Island and into that Naples area, and there's really kind of 2 timelines for the storm. There's the timeline for the strongest winds, which are out ahead of it, and the heaviest rain. That's in that northeast quadrant that's up on this side. But many are noticing around Bonita Beach and Fort Myers, the ocean's out. It almost looks like a tsunami. It's not. They're very different processes.
It's being pulled out, but it comes back.
It's toward low tide, and it's being sucked out by the hurricane. We saw some of these images in the Bahamas yesterday. That water is going to rush back in very quickly, and that happens as the center of the storm passes. So those winds counterclockwise, they'll bring in all the water that was sucked out and then some. And when we talk about evacuations, it's because of this surge. 9 out of 10 people killed in a hurricane are water. It's not wind. Wind causes a lot of damage, but water is the real danger to life.
And the next major target after, say, Naples on the Florida coast will be what?
It'll be moving right parallel to that coastline. So we're looking toward Sanibel. We're looking toward Captiva, Fort Myers area. Then we head up toward Tampa tonight. We head up to the Big Bend heading into tomorrow.
Okay, it's going to be a long day on the Florida coast.
Long way to
All right, our coverage will continue here. We're going to go to Fort Myers shortly, but we'll be right back with our coverage of Hurricane Irma. An update, as I said, from Fort Myers after this break.
We are here in St. Pete Beach, Tampa, St. Pete, the largest metropolitan area by far on the west coast of Florida. The Gulf Coast city of Fort Myers was flooded just 2 weeks ago with rain from Hurricane Harvey. Now it is preparing for another blast, this one from Irma, and Chris Van Cleve is there. Chris?
Jeff, we are seeing the winds really ramp up. We know gusts have gotten into the 60-mile-an-hour range at points, and now we've got a very heavy band of rain coming through. We were watching as the Lee County Sheriff's officers were coming off the streets. They knew when the wind hit about 40 miles an hour, all the first responders were going to come off. They came in a line, and as they were driving by us, we watched a transformer explode. We got a gust of wind that brought down part of a tree right in our path, so we've changed locations to get out of that. But we are now at the point in Lee County where you have about 30,000 people who've gone into evacuation shelters, and the folks who didn't get out of town or go to those shelters have to hunker in place. It is no longer safe to be out in the roads as we're approaching, getting closer and closer to those hurricane force winds. We know of at least 1 fatal accident. 2 people died in a collision in Hardee County. That's inland a bit between here and where you are in Tampa. And police are telling us that's an example of why they don't want people driving in this weather. It is simply too dangerous. And as you've heard Mark Strassman talk about, we're watching street signs in this parking lot back here just move like that. At some point, some of those are going to give way, and they basically become projectiles. So do the tree branches. It's going to be a very, very dangerous storm, and we're already seeing some of those things happen here. And we're talking about winds in the 60-mile-an-hour range. We know they could go up 100, 120 miles an hour, depending upon just how strong Irma is when the storm gets here. But these outer bands are packing quite a punch, and it's really been a sobering wake-up call, I think, for people here in Fort Myers. You know, they didn't have the benefit of the forecast giving them days and days of notice. This was sort of 48 hours out. It became clear that this was going to be in the bullseye, so to speak, and that's why we've seen people rushing to shelters. We were at the largest shelter here in the area yesterday. There was a line out the door before they opened it up. That shelter is now full. There are only 3 in the county here, Lee County, that are still accepting people, and first responders are really saying they'd rather you just hunker in place unless it's an absolute emergency, like your structure's been compromised, because it's just not safe to be out anymore. And keep in mind, it's going to get a lot worse for us and a lot worse for you where you are as this storm comes in. It looks like now maybe 5 o'clock tonight is when we're going to see some of the peak winds really get started, but we'll see hurricane winds here in the next couple hours.
Yeah, Chris, and unfortunately where you are, if folks have a medical emergency right now, first responders are not going to be able to go out because they don't want to put other folks in danger, so they have to wait till those winds go back down again below 45 miles an hour as Irma continues to make her way toward us here in the Tampa-St. Pete area. You can see, so we have water on both sides of us right now. Behind us is the Gulf, and you see we have about 100 yards of beach here. That water is going to get pushed out first, and then it's going to get sucked back in. And the question is how much that surge comes up on both sides as Irma moves through. And that is the #1 concern here. Yes, there's going to be a lot of rain. Yes, the wind is going to be very high, but that storm surge can be very dangerous. And having seen some of these hurricanes and tropical storms in the past, it can happen very quickly. So police are very worried about that. Sarasota is about 30-40 miles away from here. Carter Evans is there. They are also under a big threat today. Carter?
Here we go. Jeff, let me show you right here. This is a common sight all around Sarasota, these roadblocks right now. This is the bridge over to Bay Isle and Siesta Key right now. These places were evacuated as of 8 p.m. yesterday. Nobody is supposed to be there, and for good reasons. You look out to the right here. This is Sarasota Bay. You can see the white caps on the water. It is quite choppy, quite rough right now. We're going to walk down here a little bit. We're kind of in between squalls, so it's not too windy right now. We can show you around just a bit. But you were talking, Jeff, about the tide rushing out. It was low tide earlier this morning. The tide should be coming in right now, but it is still extremely low. So all of that water has gotten sucked out of the bay. You can see the high tide mark on those pilings. Now, look at that home over there. You can imagine what it's going to be like when we get back up to high tide and then we get 8 feet of water on top of that. The island behind me, only about 3 feet above sea level. So this could be a big problem. Again, this area, these low-lying areas, all evacuated by 8 p.m. last night. They're asking people to stay off the roads now, especially because even when it seems calm, I'll tell you, another squall is right around the corner.
Yeah, Carter, that's one of the big concerns. You mentioned high tide. With high tide coming in later this afternoon, then it also coincides with the storm getting even worse. So that is a big concern. Still ahead, we're going to check in with another major city in Florida, Naples. We have correspondents all over this state right now. We're back right after this.
Okay, good.
And that's how it
Irma is on the move, slowly and dangerously. In Miami, they are measuring gusts now up to 100 miles an hour, and Miami is not getting the worst of this storm. The worst may happen today in the Gulf Coast city of Naples, just south of us. Jonathan Vigliotti is there. Jonathan?
And Jeff, the gusts here about 56 miles per hour. That's only expected to grow as the hours go on. We're expecting 135 miles per hour. You could see what this is doing right now to the trees here, really whipping them around. And if you can look over here, I just want to point your direction and attention to this roof. This is a hurricane-proofed building here in Naples, and you can see this gust of wind already starting to rip this off. The wind, obviously a concern and a hazard, but the main concern, the biggest safety risk, is the storm surge. We've been talking about this all morning long. Naples is ground zero for that surge, anywhere from 10 to 15 feet high. That is high enough to cover over many buildings, and it's one of the reasons why we relocated 2 miles inland to the shelter where we are right now. There are 30 shelters that the county opened up and which are at max capacity with about 15,000 people. But as that evacuation zone started to grow even last night, people who said they were going to hunker down and ride out this storm at home really started to panic. And then that's when private shelters really came into play. This location is actually a country club. It is open for the members and also for the public. And about 500 people are now inside riding out this storm as it continues to pick up in intensity. They're there right now, actually, as they're watching what we are watching, and this storm really picking up in its brutality. My heart, though, has really got to go out to the people that are on the barrier islands, because that's where I think this story is really going to unfold in the next few hours. We're talking about Marco Island, Captiva. Those are places, really slivers of sand with high rises on them and low rises. I spoke to one person yesterday who was riding out this storm with his family there, even though that was under a mandatory evacuation. And we also have to keep in mind the community that we're in. This is a retirement community. I have heard a number of stories of senior citizens home alone riding out the storm in their homes because they just did not want to leave and had nowhere else to go and no support system. So as this storm comes through, it's that population that we really have to be worried about and focused on, especially in the aftermath of this storm. Jeff.
And those are some of the folks who may have to wait the longest for help before police can safely get back out. It does not augur well, Jonathan, that some rooftops there are already beginning to come off, considering that winds are going to get twice as bad as they are right now. We are going to be right back with more special coverage of Hurricane Irma, but as we go to break here, we want to look at some pictures from Broward County, where look at those winds and look at those palm trees. Not even the worst of it. More on Hurricane Irma after this.
Some of our CBS stations will be leaving us now for local programming, but we'll be tracking the storm throughout the day. We'll have updates during CBS sports coverage of the NFL. We'll break in immediately with any major developments, and we'll have extensive hurricane coverage on a special expanded edition of the CBS Weekend News. But first, here is Eric Fisher. And Eric, if you will, one more time, take me through the track of this storm through today, if you would.
So what we're watching right now is that eye, the center, where we have the strongest winds right around it in the eye wall, lifting away from the Keys, and it's moving up toward Marco Island and the Naples area. See Marco Island hanging right in there, and that's an area of great concern for us because it's low elevation. There's a lot of development on that island, and we're expecting a storm surge, worst case at 10 to 15 feet, and that will inundate the majority of Marco Island with that storm surge. Then it's going to parallel the coast right by Naples, heading up towards Sanibel right in here, Fort Myers in here, and then continuing up the coastline toward Tampa. If it retains Category 3 strength to Tampa, it would be the first major, which is Category 3 or higher hurricane there in almost 100 years. It's a very vulnerable spot, and a lot of people have been sending in pictures, videos of that water getting sucked out around Tampa. That's the wind blowing offshore right now, Anthony, and that water will come in very quickly as we head into this evening.
Eric Fisher, thanks very much. As I said, some of you will be leaving us now, but our coverage of Hurricane Irma will continue in a moment.
Good morning once again. Special report on Hurricane Irma here at CBS News and these extraordinary winds we are seeing in Broward County as Hurricane Irma moves up. That is the East Coast. We are on the West Coast here, St. Pete Beach, Florida. I'm Jeff Glor along with Anthony Mason at CBS News headquarters in New York as we track Irma. The storm is moving northward up the Gulf Coast of Florida. We are in St. Pete Beach. St. Petersburg and Tampa are just to our east. After making initial landfall earlier this morning in the lower Keys, that's what Irma did about 20 miles east of Key West. Irma is now tracking maximum sustained winds of 130 miles an hour. That's a Category 4 hurricane. 3 deaths are reported in Florida after more than 24 were killed in the Caribbean. This is a very wide storm. Hurricane and tropical storm winds extend out more than 200 miles from the center. Nearly 2 million homes and businesses have lost power so far, while over 100,000 people have taken refuge in shelters. We're going to check in with Adriana Diaz, who is in Orlando. Adriana?
Jeff, believe it or not, just a few hours ago, this area in downtown Orlando was full of people jogging, walking their dogs, really going about their daily business. That's because it was just drizzling. But since the rain has intensified, there seems to have been a shift in the mood. There are very few people now on the streets. Stores downtown have been closed. The mayor has instituted a mandatory curfew tonight at 7 p.m., lasting all the way until tomorrow at 6 p.m. That's nearly 24 hours. Now, she says part of the reason is because a bulk of the injuries that occur during these types of hurricanes actually happen after the hurricane passes through, when people emerge to check the damage and try to clean up. We were at a hospital yesterday. They told us that one of the top injuries they see at their trauma center is actually chainsaw accidents, people using chainsaws for the first time to try to cut down branches and debris. They also get injuries from people who fall off ladders and come in contact with downed power lines. So the mayor says people must shelter in place, stay inside until they are told by officials it is safe to go outside. The biggest concern in the Orlando area is the wind and tornadic activity. There's already been a tornado warning just east of here, about an hour away. So the mayor says even though it seems for now that Orlando has been spared a direct hit, she doesn't want to take any chances. Jeff?
Adriana, thanks. We've seen those tornado warnings here in the Tampa Bay area as well. Manuel Bojorquez is across the peninsula. He is in Fort Lauderdale. Manny, we've seen the pictures of some of the wind there. It is just incredible right now.
Yeah, these are some of the strongest sustained winds that we are seeing so far as Irma continues to batter this area. They come and go. Right now, not too bad. And then you get this gust. I want to walk over here to show you that we're starting to lose tree branches and palm tree fronds left and right. If you take a look just above, you can see what some of the upper level winds are doing right now to those palm trees. They have been swaying for hours now as they're losing palm fronds, and they've been falling many times into this canal right here. What's important to point out here is that it is rising, the water level here, as the waves are being whipped up by the winds here in North Fort Lauderdale. Also, as you mentioned, the threat here isn't just the high winds and the rain, but there are also tornado watches and warnings throughout the state, including right here in Broward County. The National Weather Service did say there was one report of a tornado touchdown yesterday. Our phones were going off with alerts pretty much all night. So on top of a long night for people here in the Fort Lauderdale area, you will have a long day because of what we're seeing right now. There will be wind damage. There will be some flooding, and that is the big concern. Law enforcement right now not going out into these elements. They stopped doing that when winds reached about 45 miles an hour, the wind gusts. And that actually happened yesterday, and this is supposed to be an all-day event. Here we go again with another one of these really strong wind gusts. The winds here are expected to reach up to 75 miles per hour, what would be the equivalent of a Category 1 hurricane. And we've talked about this before, the perspective here, that we aren't really near the eye wall, which is where the strongest impacts of the storm will be. We're about 90 miles from where it came ashore, and you can see the strong impacts that we're seeing here in the Fort Lauderdale area. There are 15,000 people right now in storm shelters riding this out. That's what officials had wanted to see, but they're not taking any more people right now. There is a curfew in place because they don't want people out in these elements. Jeff?
Manny, thanks very much. You can deal with these relative moments of quiet, which can lull you into a sense of security, which is a false sense of security, because these waves will just keep coming. And of course, Irma is going to get worse, especially here in the Tampa-St. Pete area. We're going to go to Elaine Quijano, who's in Florida City. The Hurricane Irma made landfall in the Florida Keys this morning, and Florida City is about as close as you can get right now. Elaine?
Yeah, Jeff, that's right. And when, in fact, Hurricane Irma made landfall, we could feel here in Florida City that that was happening. And that's because those winds jumped up. We were told to expect gusts in the neighborhood of 100 miles per hour. We haven't had a chance to measure ourselves, but I would not be surprised if we hit that multiple times. As an example, this sign. Look at what it's done here. The wind has sheared off part of this metal sign, and we've been watching every hour as bit by bit these winds continue to take this apart and peel away. You see these trees, bit by bit, these palm fronds have been blown away with such a tremendous velocity as these gusts have continued to pound the area here, and the rain at times is painful. It comes down in sheets and hits you in the face. Very difficult to stand, and these are the conditions that officials say no one should be out in right now. Behind me, Overseas Highway, Route 1, the way in and out of the Florida Keys, has had no signs of traffic whatsoever since we were out here early this morning, and that's because, of course, parts of Overseas Highway could in fact be washed away at this point, given the tremendous storm surge that is expected to come as Irma makes its way on its track. What we know right now in Key West, they have taken a pounding. In fact, we've been trying to contact a person that we had been in touch with earlier overnight to check and see how things were going. Have not been able to get in contact with that person, but you can imagine those punishing conditions that we've been feeling here only intensifying as this continues and as the storm progresses here. So, Jeff, folks, particularly in the Florida City Homestead area, are very mindful not to go out under these circumstances because, of course, they remember Hurricane Andrew from 25 years ago, and they know even if things seem like they're calm and in a lull, very quickly things can change, and gusts, tornadoes, these are all the things that folks here continue to be worried about in Florida City. Jeff?
Florida City Homestead got some of the worst from Hurricane Andrew in 1992. The difference was because the path that Andrew took, it affected Miami-Dade County so badly, but folks in Broward County, where Elaine is, could go down relatively quickly and help out. That is not going to be the case with this storm because it's so wide. Elaine, what were the reasons that you got from some of the folks who decided to stay in the Keys?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I asked one person, help me understand this. What is it that requires that you stay here? And the answer was kind of tough to understand, but it's basically this sense that this comes with the territory. The choice they've made, it's not just something that they've done lightly. They feel as though they have taken the proper precautions. They trust the engineering, and when those engineers say that their house is built to withstand a Category 5 storm, they trust that. They feel confident in that. We were over in Key Largo, a place that we could not get to right now if we tried, just because it's too dangerous to get out there. But in Key Largo, there's one place that was open for business. It was a restaurant called Towers Pizza. The people running that restaurant, it's a family-owned joint, they said they were going to hunker down because they wanted to stay open until the very last moment to feed the first responders, to feed the other residents of Key Largo, all of whom would go searching up and down Route 1 for anything open and would eventually find themselves at that pizza place. They said, look, we're a part of this community. We understand what it's like to live here, and we want to make sure that we serve this community that we love so much. So that really became sort of this town square, if you will, in Key Largo. But folks really determined to tough things out. We'll hope to get down there a little bit later after the storm passes, perhaps tomorrow morning, to see how those folks fare. Jeff?
Yeah, Elaine, and when you have these mandatory evacuations, this does not mean police are pulling people out of their homes, but it does mean if they have a medical emergency that police are not going to be able to respond. We've seen some of these pictures in Miami this morning of the terrible effect the wind is having, and Mark Strassman is still there. Mark, you hearing me?
I hear you fine, Jeff.
How are we doing there?
Here in, you know, it's about the same. It's the wind is still really gusty here, 60, 70 miles an hour maybe. It was a little bit too strong to continue standing in the street, so we moved up a little closer to the building where we have better protection, better shelter. I was thinking that as the storm hits, everyone's wondering, of course, two things. One, you know, crossing their fingers that human life is spared, and then two, what's going to be the impact on this area. Remember that after Hurricane Andrew hit in 1992, Florida revamped and strengthened all of its construction codes, and it has among the toughest codes now in the nation. And it was with a storm like this in mind that those codes were toughened. And this is the first major test of those new codes. How will this state, especially its new construction, stand up to a significant hurricane hurricane like Irma. So that is going to be very telling in the days ahead once the storm has passed and once we get a sense of what has been left behind and what has been taken away. The other issue here too is there are so many multiple levels of worry. Storm surge being an obvious one in an area that is so heavily coastal. But for instance, there was a worry here in Miami about construction cranes. There are a couple dozen cranes in the sky now in Miami. The city's going through a bit of a building boom. Those cranes are massive, very heavy. The counterbalance alone can weigh 30,000 pounds. The fear was that those cranes could topple. They are designed to spin in high winds, but the winds are only the cranes are only designed to absorb winds of 145 miles an hour. It does appear, of course, that those winds will not be as strong, at least here in Miami. But I've seen a video of at least one crane that appears to have toppled, not toppled to the ground, but toppled over. And that, of course, was a major worry. You don't want to be anywhere near one of those things if it collapses. So emergency officials have so many different levels of threats and risks to monitor all at once. And of course, there are bound to be surprises, both good and bad. The hope, of course, is that there are more good ones than bad ones. Jeff?
In Midtown after Superstorm Sandy, it's a dangerous situation that they're watching out for. But at this point, they just have to hope for the best because you're not going to secure those in anymore. It is a test for the infrastructure in Miami. It's an even bigger test right now for Tampa St. Pete, which does not have some of the same strict building codes, and where these buildings may be in even more danger today as we see Irma move up the coast. And we're just starting to get another wave here in the Tampa St. Pete area, which has not experienced the worst by far from what we've seen down the coast. People have largely cleared out from Tampa St. Pete. You do see occasional patrols. Actually, I see a vehicle on the beach right now making its way up, presumably sheriff or police. The beach behind us, we have about 100 yards to the water here. As we've been saying, that water is going to get pushed out first from that storm surge, and then it's going to get sucked back in. And the storm surge, again, being what will probably be the biggest threat, followed by the wind and then also the rain. I know Eric Fisher, who's chief meteorologist at our Boston station, WBZ, can talk a lot more about that. And I think he's with Anthony in New York now.
He is, Jeff. Thank you. Eric, we talked before about the fact that this storm slowed down overnight, but it's picking up speed now. What's happening?
It has to make that turn. We've got a big storm. It had some momentum to the west-northwest. That steering current that was in charge kind of gave up. So it slowed down, began the northern turn, and now it's heading up the west coast of Florida. So this is an approximate timeline for kind of the heart of Irma as it climbs its way northward. So very shortly into Naples, we're talking about those strongest winds, the core of the wind starting to move in. That'll happen in the next couple of hours and will last for several hours as well. Then as we take a look at the wind speeds, your peak gusts might be around 135 miles per hour there around Naples. Fort Myers, a couple hours later, your peak winds as we head toward the evening, we're looking at 130 mile per hour wind potential. Tampa after that, we head deeper into the night. That's where we get our highest winds. And then Tallahassee is actually as we head into the day tomorrow. And that's been a tricky part with this storm. Whenever you have a landfalling hurricane, you've got multiple hazards. We have the wind, and the wind is what many people pay attention to. But we have that surge, 10 to 15 foot potential there in southwest Florida. You have the tornadoes, which we've seen a number of in South Florida. Those warnings are going to continue northward. It's that change in friction from what we have over the open ocean to when those bands rotate ashore and come on land. That spins up these little brief tornadoes. Those can cause pockets of very rough damage. Then you have the freshwater flooding, where we could see up to a foot of rainfall in some of these bands, filling up some of the roads. And then it's just difficult to talk about the scope of the whole storm. I mean, you have the eye, and the eye contains those strongest winds moving right up the shoreline throughout the course of today and tonight. But it's also raining very heavily all the way up into Georgia, parts of South Carolina. There'll even be storm surge in those locations well removed from the center. Tropical storm warnings go all the way up to Atlanta, Georgia. So you're talking about a large region. Power outages will be quite widespread, and that will be difficult in the days to come, trying to get everyone back online. And even though, again, Miami is avoiding the worst case scenario, where a couple of days ago it looked like that eye might be coming right into the city, there is a 4-foot storm surge in Biscayne Bay right now, and that's significant. And high tide is about 90 minutes or so around Biscayne Bay. So those water levels will still come up a little bit more, Anthony. So we've got a lot to deal with here, and we have a couple of days yet to come before the storm will begin to really weaken.
Yeah, and even those, as you say, who look like they have avoided the worst they've got a big storm coming at them. All right, as Eric mentioned, the storm's headed for Tampa around 5 o'clock this afternoon. John Blackstone is in the Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg area, and he joins us now from downtown Tampa. John?
Anthony, let's talk about one of the specific vulnerabilities here in Tampa. Much of the city, the downtown area, is vulnerable, but this is Tampa General Hospital. It sits right here on the water. In fact, it's built on islands, and it's within Evacuation Zone A, what the city has designated as Evacuation Zone A, an area in which all residents have been ordered to leave. The hospital is not being evacuated. It has about 1,100 beds. Some 900 patients still there. Hospital officials say they can weather the storm, but if necessary, they'll move patients to higher floors. Another thing about Tampa General, it's the only level 1 trauma center in the region. But since it's on islands, you have to cross bridges to get there, and those bridges will be closed when winds here rise to tropical storm level. Now, it's low tide here now. When the storm surge comes in, however, here, another important facility could be threatened, and that's the Tampa Convention Center. Now, even if the Convention Center survives the flood, all events planned there into next month have now been canceled, and it may take even longer than that for Tampa to clean up, depending on what hits us here over the next 24, 36 hours. Anthony?
John Blackstone in Tampa. Thanks, John. We want to go back to Jeff Glor now, who's just gotten a pretty ominous morning from where he is in St. Pete.
Yeah, Anthony, we just heard from the sheriff who said that when this storm passes, they are going to seal off the county. Nobody in, nobody out until they do a damage assessment. They are going to seal off this county once the storm passes to make sure that it is safe to move around. They're worried about trees being down. They're worried about everything being thrown into the road. They are worried about so much, as Irma has yet to bring her worst into the Tampa-St. Pete area, where we're expecting these tropical storm force winds probably between 2 o'clock this afternoon and 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Hurricane winds probably starting around 7 o'clock tonight and lasting about 8 hours. 7 to 10, up to a foot of rain, inches of rain, and then that surge, and remains one of the big questions. Not just what direction the surge goes in, depending on where the wind is moving, but how high that surge is going to be. Is it going to be 5 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet? Right now, the expectation is that in the Tampa-St. Pete area, it'll be about 5 to 8 feet. But again, this area has not seen a major hurricane since 1921. The population of the Tampa Bay area at that time was 135,000 people. It is nearly 3 million people today. It has changed drastically since then, and the entire region is waiting to see what happens now. Jonathan Vigliotti is also along the Gulf Coast. He is south of us. He is in Naples, which is also going to get it, we expect, very bad. Jonathan?
Yeah, that's correct. And Jeff, right now we're having gusts measuring around 60 miles per hour. They're so fast that the sheriff's office is saying all emergency vehicles are now cleared from the roads. They will not be returning to the streets until that wind dies down, until the storm has long cleared. Big concern is obviously the storm surge. But before we get to that, I want to show you something we've been monitoring, which really puts into perspective the wind and the power of it and the debris that could be flying around here. We're in this hurricane protected building. It's a pretty new build. We've been talking about construction, and this roof is already starting to rip off, and the wind hasn't even picked up to the extremes that we're expecting of 135 miles per hour. So that is something to keep an eye on. And then, of course, that big concern, the storm surge, which we really can't hit home enough. We call this ground zero, Naples, ground zero for the surge, and that is the truth. We're being told anywhere from 10 to 15 feet. All of that impacting some of the lower lying areas of Naples. This is a coastal community, only 3 feet above sea level. We were there earlier today. We got a little nervous about our location that we had to move inland, where we are right now about 2.5 miles or so. But even where we are still expecting some effects from that surge, possibly 1 to 2 feet. That surge, obviously a main reason and factor for this mass evacuation that took place over the past 48 hours. This was a very tricky location. Had a lot of time and a lot of warning to leave because it looked like the storm was going to hit that East Coast very early on. This area was kind of sitting pretty. A lot of people even had friends that were coming from the East Coast to join them here to ride out the storm because being that hard hit from Irma. So a lot of people in the past 48 hours getting that reality check and trying to evacuate. We have spoken with a number of people that have chose to ride this storm out at home. About 15,000 people, we are told, went in. Are outside one of those shelters right now where we are planning on riding out the storm for the rest of the night. Jeff, back to you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. We just got another chilling update from the sheriff here. They just told us that they found a father and son on a boat about 6 miles north of here, Madeira Beach, trying to ride out the storm. The sheriff's department told them they had to leave, and they said if they weren't going to leave, they were going to forcibly remove the son from the boat. The father, we are told, made the proper decision to both leave. So we understand at this point that the department has been able to get that father and son off the water. But given what we're about to deal with right now, we saw some people in Miami, in Coral Gables, next to mangroves, where it might be a little safer to try to protect their boat, trying to ride out the storm when they're not getting the eye of the storm. But leaving a small boat on this water right now, I'm not sure what world that is a good idea in, but it appears from what the sheriff's department has told us, he made the right decision, and we understand that they should be safe now. It does take a major storm to shut down Disney World, which is to our east. It is called the happiest place on earth. It is closed today. Adriana Diaz is in Orlando right now with an update. Adriana?
Jeff, that's right. Disney World is closed, but they're not alone. SeaWorld, Universal Studios, they all closed down last night. Disney World will be closed for at least 2 days, and this is a decision that is not taken lightly. It's only closed 4 or 5 times in its history, and this is one of those occasions. Now, Disney World Hotel and Resorts, those remain open. Those are nearly at capacity, and Disney World told us yesterday that their buildings are secure. They can withstand these winds. We're expecting to see winds in the 80s and 90s at its peak here in this area. Now, if you look around here, there really aren't that many cars in the roads. That's because officials say stay off the roads, stay inside, because what they want is for emergency personnel to be able to get to where they're going. There are a few exceptions besides emergency personnel. Medical staff can go out. Also, some people in the services industry, people who provide food, work at hotels, because officials want people who are sheltering in hotels, visiting from downstate, or folks who live in mobile homes who are under mandatory evacuations, who have moved into hotels, will be able to ride out the storm with what they need. Jeff?
Adriana, thank you very much. About 40 miles down the coast here is Sarasota, which also faces a huge threat from Irma today. Carter Evans is there. Carter?
You know, Jeff, it feels like these winds are starting to pick up. It's still tropical storm force winds, but we're definitely having a steady gust now. The tide is also beginning to come in. You can look at it lapping up against the side here, but it's still got a long way to go. This hurricane appears to have sucked a lot of this water out of Sarasota Bay, and as you look at the bay, you can see how many of these grand, expensive homes are right on the water here. We'll pan across, and you can see the bridge to some of these barrier islands as we get a strong squall that comes through right now. These barrier islands, you can see a lot of homes right on the water line here. If we pan over just a little bit, this is Bay Isle. I know it's a little windy for you. If we pan over, this is Bay Isle. You can see some of the boats already lifted out of the water there. It's unclear whether they're going to be okay. I want to show you the high tide line on this pier and give you an idea of how much water we might experience here. Again, the high tide going to be around 4 o'clock this afternoon in this area. So we've got about 2 feet to go before we get high tide, and then we've got the storm surge on top of that. That could be another 8 feet. So by my measurements, if that 8 feet storm surge does come, we could have 2 to 4 feet of water right where I'm standing in about 8 hours or so. Jeff?
All right, Carter Evans, thank you very much. He is in Sarasota, not in good shape right now at all. Hurricane Irma is moving up the Gulf Coast of Florida about 9 miles an hour. We are going to be tracking this storm throughout the day. But right now, we are going to go to the West Coast again. Yeah, David Begnaud, just across the bay here, actually, in Tampa. David?
We are about to get punched in the face by this storm. Those are the words of the mayor of Tampa, who's just announced that a curfew goes into effect at 6 o'clock tonight. We're on the Riverwalk. You've got the Hillsborough River here. The University of Tampa is behind me, and downtown Tampa is that way. Where I'm walking now, the thought is that you could be swimming here within the next 12 hours. The water is moving in the way of the low tide, heading out toward the bay. We're hearing that when the storm actually moves in, it will happen around high tide. So you've got the water that's coming in from the Gulf, will move across the bay, which is about 700 miles of coastline, and right up here. This is essentially a choke point. The water's got nowhere to go but out. Every hotel, business, the college around here is a ghost town. You've got the people lurking, taking selfies and photos who are hanging out in the area. One of the local sheriffs in the area was on television a short time ago telling people that if you haven't gotten out and you want to, it's probably too late. Here's a concern for them right now. Some of the evacuation routes out of the Tampa area may already be accumulating water on the roadway. And the trouble is, if you haven't gotten out, when you do want to, maybe 6 hours from now, those roadways and evacuations areas may be underwater. Coming into Tampa, you'll have no trouble. You might get flagged down by a police officer. Yesterday, for probably 12 hours or more, we saw a line of vehicles, people just heading out of town. A lot of people saying, hey, I didn't have as much of a heads up as the folks on the east coast of Florida had. It kind of took me by surprise here in Tampa. The cars were back to back, going 15 to 20 miles per hour as people just headed east down the I-4 corridor toward Orlando. We've seen the rain bands move in. It's now tapering off just a little bit, but once again, here in Tampa, 6 o'clock curfew tonight. The mayor is saying what's happening here and what they're expecting to happen will require everybody to help their neighbors by the time this storm moves through. Jeff?
We see some folks walking there behind David Begnaud, and they can walk around right now, and I think there is still time to get to higher ground in the Tampa-St. Pete area, but that window to get to safety is quickly disappearing as Irma rakes its way slowly up the west coast of Florida with a potential landfall here in St. Pete and Tampa later on this evening or early tomorrow morning. Continues moving Irma at this deliberate and dangerous pace of about 9 miles an hour. We are going to have updates throughout the day on this storm. We'll also have updates during CBS Sports coverage of the NFL. We will break in with any major developments, of course, and we'll have extensive hurricane coverage this evening on an expanded edition of the CBS Weekend News. For now, with Anthony Mason, who is in New York, I'm Jeff Glor, CBS News, St. Pete Beach, Florida.
For news 24 hours a day, go to CBSNews.com.